I hope you had a good night last night. I see a few dropping heads, but we'll get through it. I'd like to thank my sponsors, the Nuffield food chain and the Worshipful Company of Fruiterers, for their generous sponsorship, which has enabled me to have a look at this subject, which has made up my Nuffield Scholarship. I should also thank the guys back at home, my family, and especially to my wife, who some of you here will know sent me a text at 1 o'clock in the morning at the CSC when I was in Cavan Island saying, "I think you better come home." I knew that our first son was due in a few days' time, and I'd spoken to her the night before, or that night, and she said, "I feel a bit weird, but the midwife says it's okay, and we'll see how we are in the morning." I was then at the bus station in Cavan at 20 to 3 in the morning to catch a coach to Dublin, and I did my level best, but missed his arrival by 8 minutes. I think I've made up for it since then. My title is somewhat ambiguous, and I make no real apology for that. The challenges facing apple and pear production in the UK are broad and far-reaching, and similar to the other speakers that we've heard here, we have issues with labour and all sorts of challenges. So I wanted to take the opportunity to use this study tour to go and have a look at other countries and see what other people are doing to address some of these challenges and see what we could bring back home to make a difference. I went to Western Australia firstly because it's Perth being one of the most isolated cities in the world. The production in Western Australia is largely grown and sold for the domestic market with some export. It's also the home of Pink Lady, one of the biggest apple brands in the world. I then moved on there to Victoria, down to Tasmania, which one of my fellow scholars kindly reminds me is not another country, but the Tasmanians will thank me for mentioning it. And then on to New Zealand, which is really right up there in the benchmark, in my opinion, of producing apples and pears. So in terms of production, for us as farmers, there's all manner of challenges that we face. Some we can control, some we can't. We need to look at growing systems in light of climate change, and everything we need to do is about optimising what we're doing to make sure that our orchards perform to produce the right marketable yield of production despite what the weather throws at us. There are issues of labour, as we've heard from Jan. This year has been difficult. It's going to get more difficult with people less likely to want to come and work here. On my opening slide, you will have noticed a little heartbreak sign that represents Brexit, but we all know we haven't got time to stand here and talk about that. It's certainly going to be an ongoing challenge with all of these issues. Pest and disease are a major part of our challenge, and I think we, for many years in conventional farming, and I've never been one to advocate organic versus conventional, but we have been wrapping our plants up in a chemical bubble in order to achieve yield and concentrating on yield rather than overall plant health. Tie that in with soil and how we look after our soil. In Top Fruit, we're perennial croppers, so we're looking at 15, 20-year life cycles on our orchards. But how much are we actually doing to look after the soil in that time? We can certainly see that when we rush in to put a new orchard in behind a previous one, that things do not always go well, and we repent at leisure. Sunlight is quite significant. It's encouraging to hear cherries being grown in Scotland. I also grow some cherries, but one of the main things that I've been looking at in terms of apples and pears is where our levels of production are. Similar to potatoes, we don't really produce enough per hectare of marketable production. I should have chosen a better word than marketable. But anyway, it's not about just tons, it's about tons of the right quality. And at 54 degrees north, we don't enjoy as much sunlight as some of our fruit-growing counterparts around southern Europe and in the southern hemisphere. New Zealand at 40 degrees south enjoys around about 2,200 hours of sunlight, which we did interestingly achieve in the early 90s in Chichester, but it's never happened since. We've also heard from some of my fellow scholars about how highly developed and sophisticated our retail sector is. Our retailers are some of the most developed in the world and really understand how their consumers work, so they can feel back information to us about what customers want and how that works. One of the challenges for us as apple and pear growers is that they've identified the perfect way of selling an apple to a consumer, and it happens to be in a 6-pack in a flow wrap for a set price, and that brings certain challenges. If I was manufacturing ball bearings and a consumer said, "I want this specification," that'd be fine. I would engineer that to that specification. I would send it, and naturally, if it was out of spec, it would be rejected. Unfortunately, we have this high level of competition on our high street between retailers, and where they've all identified which is the best way of selling an apple, they all want to sell the same apple. So growing a product on trees in the UK climate gives us quite a spread at times of size, colour, shape, sugar, all sorts of contributing factors to quality. And that means that we then have a percentage of our crop at all times that isn't worth quite so much money. This year, for the first year, as long as I can remember, I've been sending quite a lot of fruit to Holland. And that's really only on the back of some fairly catastrophic frosts experienced in April this year, where they had -9, -10-degree frosts. We had -2, so it wasn't so bad, but pretty bad. But otherwise, we're net importers of fruit, as our industry is only about 35% self-sufficient of apples and pears. The level of sophistication that we're dealing with in our marketplace is really what brings about the high-cost supply chain. And so when you visit a pack house in New Zealand or Australia, you see a big shed, very complicated grader doing the work that same as our graders in the UK do, and then they're just being packed into 18-kilo cardboard cartons, put it in containers, and sent to Asia, where they're prepared to pay good money for good food. Interestingly, one of the people I visited in New Zealand told me that typically in Asia, as people become more wealthy, they spend more on food. So they uptrade in terms of their purchasing and their eating habits. Whereas in the Western world, certainly Northwest Europe and the US, the more we earn, the less we spend proportionally on food. So Asia, really exciting market. And to see how well the guys are doing in New Zealand, growing all sorts of things, from kiwi, grapes, hops, apples, pears, and they're absolutely thriving, and it's really good to see. Our pack houses in the UK are like crazy factories. We might be packing 30 lines of different pack types for different retailers. We have flow wrap lines, polybagging lines, loose lines, and it is absolute chaos. Well, it looks like chaos, but those running them know exactly what's going on. When I initially started off on this tour, and I remember in my interview, I'd said, what I want to do is I want to understand the role of the grower in the supply chain. Very often you'll find a grower or a farmer feels that they supply the supply chain, rather than recognizing that they are the first link. Everything within the supply chain stems from the grower or the farmer. And so as I went round, I've done a lot of work on looking at collaboration between growers and significant involvement in producer organisations and trying to get growers to work together to gain benefits of scale and to shorten supply chains. But I quickly began to realise that actually we're not getting the fundamentals right, and so there was a bit of a shift towards looking at production rather than looking at wider collaboration and how growers do that, although I did touch on that on my travels. In New Zealand in 2004 they had a bumper crop, and they produced it on the back of this area at 41 tonnes per hectare. In 2017 they'd matched that volume, and they had reduced the area, and they had increased their output to 61 tonnes per hectare. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have as much sunlight as New Zealand, so everyone says, well, you can't get that yield because you don't have the sunlight. Got it. But should we be aiming for somewhere near 77% of their maximum yield based on us having 77% of their average sunlight? I mean, it's a very basic metric, but it's something we should look at. There is no game plan in the UK in terms of UK top fruit. What is our target yield per hectare? We don't really have one. We struggle around at about 30 tonnes a hectare, and to be perfectly honest, it's not good enough because we will not be able to compete on price, and our retailers will always be looking to foreign shores to make sure they can sell and provide our consumer with good value. We need to look at optimising absolutely everything to make sure we can get the job right in the UK. Understanding the market is crucial to that, and to see how a farmer is going to work with a supply chain, within the supply chain, is absolutely essential that we know what the customer wants. Very much like Jan is saying about late-stored cherries and about luxury, apples and pears, the consumption is also static. But they're always there in somebody's fruit bowl, but we've got to do a better job of delivering what the consumer needs. And the only way we can do that is to manage the way we work together to shorten supply chains, increase communication, and drive transparency through our supply chains. This is just a quick look at the numbers. It's meaningless if the sun doesn't shine and if you haven't got anyone to pick your crop. But if everything goes all right, what can you do? And at 47 tonnes per hectare at the last 5-year average price, you can achieve sensible gross margins on a UK farm in terms of apples and pears. If you push that up to 60 tonnes, which is still not at 77% of New Zealand's target, you can push it up to nearly £17,000 a hectare. If you then work together and negotiate for better price, you actually can increase your gross margin by up to 40% by actually getting a better retail price because of the amount of cost that is associated with your hectares as opposed to your kilos. This slide really just looks at how we bridge the gap. My business sits in the second column from the left, in that we have good production, we have cold storage, and we have some transport, but we don't have packing and grading facilities. We certainly don't have direct marketing, although I am involved with a marketing desk, which is partly owned by growers. But really, this just identifies that we've got a lot of people that are good growers, but then we then got one or two very large businesses that are completely vertically integrated, supplying the retailers and doing a very good job. So there's a lot of work to be done on how we bring these together to make sure everyone can get a fair crack of the whip. What we know that doesn't work anymore is just trading, just going out there trying to get the best price, here today, gone tomorrow. Promiscuity, some of the retailers like to call it, which sounds a bit ominous, but staunch independence. We have to work together, we have to share labour, we have to share machinery, we have to share services, and we have to share knowledge. We can't go on just doing what we've always done, 30 tonnes a hectare of whatever we've done, and see if the market will sell it. This is really just the start for me after embarking on this study. There's a lot to be done working out how we can capitalise it. A new hectare of orchards costs £25,000 to £30,000 a hectare, and so you can't just do that out of thin air. We need to look to alternative markets, how we can innovate, and make sure we can utilise the whole crop to make the job more profitable. Thank you very much all for listening.